Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk, Anti-Racist Graphics Research. Now, there's going to be a lot of pictures in this talk, but before we get to that, let's get some concepts down. All right, computer graphics research has a race problem. Now, we're going to see a lot of dimensions of this problem this week at the SIGGRAPH DEI Summit, many of which grapple with the idea that our hiring and promotion practices are not equitable. Now, this is a big problem, but it would be a mistake to think that this is the whole picture. Now, I'm going to talk about this problem specifically in research. I am not talking about those other versions. Instead, what I mean is that our basic scientific formulations have insidious biases built into them. Now, this is an extremely uncomfortable and disturbing version of this because many of us are used to thinking that math is math and physics is physics, and we resist the idea that science could contain any sort of bias. In fact, this is what attracted many of us to the sciences to begin with, right? So we get to look at these clean, neutral problems all day, and we don't have to get all tangled up in the ugly politics of the real world. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't look like this is the case. So the term systemic racism has been appearing a lot lately. And the point of systemic racism is that historically racist assumptions have been baked into many of our everyday institutions, whether we like it or not. Now, science is not an exception to this, and computer graphics is not an exception to this. So you may have heard a related term to this, unconscious bias. It is intimately connected. So if we don't consciously think about the racial implications of our work, we just end up reproducing all of the existing inequalities that exist in the systems that are around us. Now, if we don't believe that these biases and these inequalities reflect the world that we want to live in, then we have to take deliberate, concrete steps that counter this bias. This is the anti-racist part of this title. We recognize the pull of historical inertia, and we make the deliberate decision to take a step in the opposite direction. Okay, that was a quick text-only outline of this talk. Let's delve into each component that I mentioned in order. First, we'll look at racial bias in research. Bias in science? What's he talking about? Isn't math just math? Up to a point. How do we formulate the research problems that we work on? How does a problem formulation influence the solution? And how does the math that we come up with then encode our assumptions? From this perspective, I'll show you that yes, bias is real. Second, well, then where did it come from? Has there been some evil secret society of racists working in our field this entire time? Well, if that were the case, then the solution would be easy, right? We would just expel the racists and then we'd be done. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So where did it come from? And once we have an understanding of these other two pieces, what can we do about it? All right, let's get back to the first part, racial bias in research. So let's start with a seemingly basic question. What is human skin? So more specifically, when we talk about human skin in computer graphics, what are we talking about? Now, there's a bunch of ways to go about looking at this, and we actually will look at this from a few directions. But since this is SIGGRAPH, let's look at what SIGGRAPH does best. So university research gets transferred into industry, and then that spills over into pop culture. All right, so here's a SIGGRAPH paper from 20 years ago. Jensen et al. Is a practical model for subsurface light transport. This is from SIGGRAPH 2001. Now, this was a blockbuster paper when it was first published. So as of today, it has over 1,100 citations on Google Scholar, which as far as rendering papers goes, is a really high number of citations. All right. So the reason for this popularity was that it was one of the first papers to show how to get subsurface scattering right. Now, if you get subsurface scattering right, you get a much more realistic looking human face. Now, it wasn't the first paper to try this. For example, Hanrahan and Kruger had tried this previously. But it was the first paper that had widespread commercial success. So it was the first algorithm that was picked up by lots of commercial vendors. Okay, so I know that there's a diverse set of backgrounds in the audience here. So let's just review some of the nuts and bolts of subsurface scattering. So let's go back to Computer Graphics 101. All right, so ray tracing. So usually when we learn ray tracing, we ray trace hard surfaces, right? So light, it gets emitted from a light source on the upper left here. It comes down to hit some object, and then it actually bounces off of that object from the exact same location as it hit it, right? So it comes down, hits the object, bounces off like a billiard ball. If you simulate this just right and see how the light rays like hit a film plane, that sort of thing, then you get an image. All right, so this model, it's pretty good at representing hard, shiny surfaces like metals. So you go back to classic graphics research papers like Cook-Torrance from 1982, and you see, yeah, it looks pretty good, right? So this looks like a copper pot, and that is because we're using the assumption that the light ray bounces off from the exact same place as it hit. So subsurface scattering, this is subtly different. So again, a light ray is emitted from a light source in the upper left here. But what happens when it hits a surface is the light ray actually enters the medium. So something like milk or soap or skin, this matches a material where this would happen. So it bounces around a few times inside the medium, and then it exits the medium from a slightly different place from where it first hit. So the effect that this has is the light ray kind of spreads out in space. It gives the object a softer look. It gives it kind of a glow. All right, so this is the type of skin glow that you see in famous paintings, so like in these Vermeer paintings, right? So these women, their skin glows in a very desirable way. All right, so now we get to the difficult part. All skin does do this to some extent. This effect is actually most important in white skin. So here's a Britney Spears ad from around that same time that paper was published, and you can see, yeah, there's a lot of subsurface scattering happening on her face. So the same with Gisele Bündchen right here. This is a Vogue cover also from 2001, and you can see lots of subsurface scattering actually happening. What about black skin though? All right, so here's a shot from the Spike Lee movie Clockers. This is 1995, again, so around the same era. And what's the important thing here? All right, so subsurface scattering does not really appear to be the dominant light transport mode here. So it's not really the glow that is important on Delroy Lindo's face, it's the shine. So I would say that specular reflection is actually the dominant light transport mode here. All right, that is actually what gives Delroy Lindo's face all of its expressive character, not that he has a ethereal glow about him. All right, but if you remember working in graphics around 2001, it's really easy to remember people just snapping up this subsurface scattering technique. So back then, humans in movies, they look really terrible. So do you remember this movie back from 2001, Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within? So you probably don't, because it tanked at the box office. And this is the main character from the film. This is one of her glamorous intro shots, actually. You can see she looks pretty terrible, right? So she has all the uncanny valley stuff going on. Her skin looks very hard and plasticine, and it's quite disturbing to look at. This may be one of the reasons why this movie tanked. All right, so the next year, this movie came out, Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, and it won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects. It even got nominated for Best Picture. So the enduring image from that movie is Gollum, and he is whiter than white. Right? He's a subterranean being who has not seen the sun in years and years. And Peter Jackson had to get this fish belly translucency to his skin just right. And they did get it right. And the reason was because Weta Digital snapped up that Jensen 2001 paper and applied it to Gollum. So you're not going to find anybody that is whiter or more translucent than Gollum. And on a personal note, I was actually working at Rhythm and Hue Studios back in 2001 when this paper came out. So even before the Two Towers came out, everybody wanted this technique. So as soon as a preprint was posted, everybody wanted it, including the people at Rhythm and Hues. So they wanted it specifically for rendering human skin. So there was a secret James Cameron project called Brother Termite that they were trying to bid on. And for that, they needed realistic humans. So they had to have this, the subsurface scattering. All right, so in graphics, when we talk about skin, we're talking about subsurface scattering. And that is the dominant visual component of a white skin. So when we talk about skin in graphics, we're talking about white skin. All right, so we can actually see this pattern in the technical literature if we start going forward in time from that Jensen paper. All right, so here's that same image from before, but I've included the caption as well. So you can see that this was labeled as a face and they are measured values for skin. So nobody said white face, nobody said white skin. It's implicitly understood. All right, let's look at the papers that come after this and see how this language rolls forward. All right, here's another paper from that same year, a skin layer. Here's a paper from the next year. Here's a skin shader. Here's a 2005 paper. This is a picture of human skin. 2007, once again, this is human skin. It's even in the title. 2008, again, human skin. Again, it's even in the title. 2010, here's a paper on skin appearance. 2011, this is a teaser image with a human face. Here's 2013, human skin. 2015, skin. 2017, skin material. And here's just from last year, 2020, skin. All right, so again, we come back to the same point. When we talk about skin in computer graphics, we're talking about white skin. So if you go back and look at all these papers, it's not like I just cherry picked the images of white people and there were like renderings of black and brown people in those papers too. There are only images of white people in those papers. Now, there are some papers that try to hit different skin tones. So for example, there was this one back in 2006, so good for them. And here's another one from 2006. So great, yeah, someone did try to hit some other types of skin tones. Unfortunately, these are the exceptions, not the rule. So in graphics, when we talk about skin, overwhelmingly, we are talking about white skin. So let's try to take a look at the same phenomena, but from a slightly different perspective. All right, so here's a book by Professor Sophia Noble at UCLA. She's one of the leading scholars on bias in algorithmic bias in technology. So let's borrow one of the techniques that she describes in her book, Algorithms of Oppression. So it's very revealing when you do a Google image search of certain keywords to see out in the community what is the perception of certain words. All right, so let's do that. Let's do a Google image search of skin shader. That is another way to measure in graphics when we say skin, what do we mean? All right, and here is what you get when you Google image search skin shader. Again, all white. Here's the next page, all white. Here's the next page. Oh, hey, there's one black eye, so that's great. One black eye at least. And here's the next page. Oh, it's not a trend. And here's the next page. All right, so once again, in graphics, when we talk about skin, we're talking about white skin. There was the one exception, but overwhelmingly, we're talking about white skin. When we're talking about white skin, we're talking about subsurface scattering. So this relation, it has now been codified into the math. So we can write it down as a double integral. We can isolate the BSSS RDF term, and we can start developing numerical methods for it. Now, something very insidious happens here. It looks like we've just rigorously isolated the skin appearance, the physics of skin appearance in some mathematical sense. Now, once you have a very scary equation like this wrapped up in a double integral, it is essentially set in stone. So now suddenly, nobody outside of an extremely small specialist community has the standing to dispute that this is not skin. But what we did was really, we just carved out the piece of physics that's the most important to white skin. This is not all skin. All we're trying to do is emulate the types of skin that dominated ads and magazines and movies in the late 90s. So let's look at the same thing from a third direction, commercial renderers. So I can't take credit for this approach. My brilliant colleague, Professor Raki Syed from Victoria University in Wellington, she suggested looking at this perspective. All right, so here is the skin tutorial from the Arnold renderer. So up until recently, here's their skin shader. You can see it's all geared towards a very specific type of skin. There's a newer version of this in the documentation as well. If you click on that, the story is still the same. It's still all white skin. All right, let's look at RenderMan, Pixar's skin shader. Here is the only picture in the documentation. Once again, when we're talking about skin, we're talking about white skin. And here's Redshift's documentation for skin shading. Again, it's quite clear what is meant when they say skin. Now, you see a picture of one person here. If you scroll down in this doc, it is this one person repeated over and over. I counted. This person's image appears 63 times. There's not a single other human anywhere else in this page. All right, and if we go back to the Arnold renderer, their website actually has a gallery of user results that has been generated from their software. You can see it here. And you can see what is a proper use of their technology, right? Again, this is all white humans. So this is what the technology was developed for. Okay, so we've now seen 3 instances of skin actually meaning white skin. So first, from the technical papers published at SIGGRAPH and related conferences. Second, a more popular community understanding of it from Google image search. And third, the commercial understanding of it as documented from widely used renderers. So at this point, I hope we can agree that, yes, this bias is real. So there's more to explore here, but I'm going to leave that for the next section because skin is not actually the only time that this sort of bias has happened. All right, so we're still on this first part, what racial bias, but I'm going to switch gears here slightly, and it's because it's not just all about skin. All right, what is human hair? In computer graphics, when we talk about hair, what are we talking about? All right, so let's do it all again. We can go way back in our technical papers, and there's early stuff from example from Ken Angio's group in Japan. All right, so straight black hair. This is characteristic of East Asians, right? So of course, this is the type of hair that they simulated. This is my hair. So this is only one type of hair though, right? So there's lots of different types of hair out there. There's even a type system for this. So this is a very popular one called the Walker system. This is used by professional stylists. So straight hair, again, it's only one type of hair, right? So you can see that it's type 1 here. Now, if we go way to the other side, to the opposite of straight hair, that's kinky hair, type 4 hair here. Right, so that's hair like this. So people refer to this in lots of different ways. So Afro-textured hair, kinky hair, coiled hair, and it's really curly, and it's so curly that there actually are kinks in the follicles. So that's why it's called kinky hair. All right, so let's look in the technical literature. What kind of hair are we going to see? All right, so we already saw this, straight hair. All right, here is hair from 2001. Again, this is what counts as hair. 2003, this is human hair. 2005, here is complex hair. 2008, this is hair. 2009, this is a hair mesh to generate hair. 2011, this is a reflectance model for hair. 2014, interactive hairs. And 2016, hair meshes. All right, and all the way up to last year, this is a teaser image where we see hair. Okay, so we see the same thing again, right? Straight hair counts as hair. We did not see a single instance of kinky type 4 hair. All right, so we can go back to the Britney Spears and Giselle ads, and we see the exact same phenomena, right? Their hair is super straight. Actually, Britney Spears's hair is actually not even that straight. She actually had it artificially straightened. So when we talk about hair in computer graphics, we're actually trying to reproduce these ads. So this is not that idle of a comparison. So here's a screen grab from a recent Pantene ad. You can actually go look at this ad on YouTube. And here's the images from a recent paper from 2017. So the big moment in a shampoo ad is the hair flip, right? So we can see we've been trying to just get the hair flip from a shampoo ad with super straight blonde hair right this entire time. So what about this type of hair? So the fiber assemblies that resemble type 4 hair, do those ever appear in our technical publications? The answer is yes, actually, but they're not recognized as hair. All right, so here is a paper from 2017, and look at the top. Hey, that ball of stuff, that looks a lot like type 4 hair, right? But look down at the caption. It is not hair, it is fibrous material. So the idea that this could also count as hair, it is not in our technical vocabulary. Now, the really weird thing is that later on in that same paper, hair does make an appearance. So here's what they're doing. They're taking two tubes of hair and they're colliding them against each other in order to demonstrate the efficacy of their technical algorithm. And you can see it in the caption, right? They refer to this as hair. Now, if we look at these two examples side by side, realistically, neither of these are hair, right? It's not like either of these are on some human head. These are highly abstract technical benchmarks that have been constructed. But even within this super highly abstract benchmark scenario, this counts as hair, and this is not hair. Again, it's just not within our technical language. So in our technical vocabulary, hair is not type 4 hair. Hair is straight hair. So it is whatever hair is characteristic of Europeans and East Asians. And in fact, it really is straight hair. So even when we talk about curly hair, we have to say curly hair. So it's implicitly understood that when you say hair, you mean straight hair. If you want to talk about curly hair, you have to say it, curly hair. So Pixar published a paper on this a few years ago. So this was the curly hair system used on the character of Merida and Brave. Even they had to say it in their title. This is a system for curly hair. If they had just said hair, everyone would have understood, oh, you mean straight hair. All right, so this is actually a phenomenon pointed out by my brilliant colleague, Professor A.M. Dark. What we're seeing here is actually a very specific form of bias. This is called anti-blackness. So this is actually a very slightly different example from what we saw with skin. It is not actually that we're favoring white features. It is that we are explicitly avoiding black features. So black features bad doesn't count as hair. That is actually what we're seeing here. So again, let's borrow a page from Professor Noble's methodology and let's Google hair shader. What do we see? All right, this is the first page of hits. Super straight hair. All right, last time we were lucky and we hit, the one picture of the black person. Let's see what happens. Next page. No luck. Next page. No luck. Next page. Next page. I actually scrolled for a really long time. There is never anything that even approaches type 4 hair. I didn't find a single type 4 hair example. All right, and let's do it again. Let's use the methodology of my colleague, Professor Syed. Let's see how this is all reflected in commercial software. All right, so here we go again. This is the documentation for the Arnold renderer, all straight hair. Here is Pixar's documentation for RenderMan, all straight hair. Here is the documentation from Redshift, all straight hair. And last of all, let's look at Arnold's feature gallery again. This time, instead of looking at the skin, let's look at the hair. Again, all straight hair. Nothing that even approaches type 4 hair. All right, so in graphics, when we talk about skin, we're talking about white skin. We're talking about hair, we mean everything except for the hair that is characteristic of Black people. All right, so hopefully you agree this bias is real. Where did it come from? Was there some evil cabal of researchers at the beginning of graphics who just said, let's just focus on the features of white people? So again, the answer here is no, because that would be an easy answer. In that case, we can just expel those racists, and then we can just think a little harder about our algorithms in the future. That's not what happened. So we live in a world that's shaped by history, and all this has actually happened before. So all the patterns that we see here, we're not that special. So this isn't, it's not that special to computer graphics. This all happened in the analog photography and analog film eras. So we entered into the scene when everything went digital, and we did it all over again. Right? So this is cyclical. And since it's cyclical, it's a little hard to know where to start in the history, but let's start with the development of color film. All right, now again, to non-specialists, math is math and physics is physics. And let's add one last thing here. So chemistry is chemistry. All right, so color film. analog color film. This was just developed to capture the colors of the world, right? Chemistry is chemistry. All right, so here's a shot from Renoir's 1952 movie, The Golden Coach. This was shot in Technicolor. So this is not Renoir, the famous painter. This is his son, Renoir, the famous filmmaker, right? So let's look at the difference between the white actor and the black actor. What is going on with the black actor? You can't even see his face. It's like he doesn't even have eyes. He doesn't even have teeth. Is he in shadow? No, he is not. All right, here's another shot from the same movie. Where you can look at the small child in the center here. He's offering a treat to the white audiences that is watching the play. Again, you can't see his face at all. It's really astonishing, right? If I went in and I photoshopped his face out, this picture actually would look exactly the same. Here's the last one. Now you can see their faces here a little bit, at least. That's because literally there is a light source a few inches from their face, right? They're holding those candelabras. So you still can't even see their eyes or their teeth. So what's going on here? Well, actually, the entire color film process has been calibrated to capture skin tones. But which skin tones were they talking about when they said skin tones? Well, once again, it meant white skin tones. All right, so for this, we can look at the concept of leader ladies, otherwise known as China girls or girl heads. So I have to thank my esteemed colleague Claudia Davis for introducing me to this archive on the Chicago Film Project. So they have a repository for this concept. All right, so the analog film development process, it was literally calibrated to capture the appearance of white skin. So what would happen is that when you were developing film, you would attach several frames of a white woman to the beginning of the film, and this was known as a leader lady or a China girl. And you would know that the chemical balances in your development bath, they were correct if the skin tones of this leader lady started showing up correctly. And what has happened here is the Chicago Film Society, they have collected all the instances that they could find of leader ladies, because this is usually a very forgotten piece of film technology. All right, so as we can see, you keep going on, and who are the people that are leader ladies? Again, it is always a white woman. Sometimes there's a Chinese person, so you can see on the lower left here, there's one Asian looking person. But again, the vast majority, overwhelmingly, it is white skin. All right, so again, by flesh tones, what did we mean? Of course, it meant the chemical process was calibrated for white skin. It happened in the analog era as well. So actually the historical echo here, I find it's really striking. So here's that tableau of leader ladies from the Chicago Film Society. And on the right, you can see, again, here is the gallery in the Arnold renderer. So this is systemic racism in action. These are the biases that are just baked into the history of our medium. So we didn't think about these biases when we were developing the algorithms, just like the chemists didn't think about it when they were developing color film. And in doing so, we just unconsciously reproduced all of the biases that surrounded us. So if you're interested in the history of this sort of thing, there's this really great book that was just published called Girlhead by a professor named Genevieve Yu. So one of the things I haven't done justice to here is there's a real, there's a really big gender component to this as well. I haven't talked about that at all. And if you're interested in this, I highly recommend Professor Yu's book. All right, so going back to the Golden Coach, you might have an objection to my characterization here. You could say, well, if they had just lit the black characters correctly, or maybe fussed with the shutter speed of the camera, maybe they would have just shown up fine. So that's fair. So the film itself, it is not the only piece of technology that is at work here. There's tons of lighting and costuming and makeup that goes into making everything show up on film. So more precisely, you need to make sure that the things that show up in the preferred color and brightness ranges of whatever film that you're actually using. All right, so maybe that's what was actually happening. The lighting was off. All right, so let's look at the technology of movie lighting. So Here is one of the classics of that genre. This is John Alton's 1949 book, Painting with Light. So there's lots of manuals on this. This is a good one though, and I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere. This is well known enough in graphics that other people have actually titled their papers Painting with Light, or they've even done like cheeky knockoffs of this title, like Lighting with Paint. So this is a fairly well-known lighting manual. All right, and if you want to know how to light a face, you look at chapter 5, the Hollywood close-up. And again, we see the exact same phenomenon here that we saw in our own technical papers. So lighting a human face. What does he mean when he says a human face? This is a human face. This is a human face. Human face. Human face. Well, it's pretty clear what's meant here, right? So human face equals a white face. Now, this book was written in the 1940s. So of course, this was the bias that pervaded the book in the 1940s. We're not trying to judge John Alton, by 2021 standards, but we're living in 2021, so we shouldn't be using the standards from the 1940s. That part is for sure. All right, so let's be fair. At the end of this chapter, he does have one paragraph about lighting colored people. So you can read this through, but the summary here is, well, just light it the same as white skin. And to his credit, he does have a shot of Hattie McDaniel, the first African-American ever to win an Academy Award. Perhaps as a characterization of how much care went into this section of the book, though, he actually does misspell her name. So it is McDaniel, not McDaniels. So again, my esteemed colleague, Claudia Davis, she has informed me that yes, Hattie McDaniel's history in Hollywood is extremely fraught, and I'm not going to try to characterize it here. But unfortunately, this is yet another instance of the difficulty that race has played in the development of film technology. All right, so what else does John Alton say in this chapter of his book? All right, so there's something called the orange rule. Now he says, when you're first starting out, you probably can't pay a model to just sit for you while you light them. So here's a bargain basement suggestion. All right, go get an orange, and instead of lighting an expensive human face, just light that orange instead. It's got a warm color with a, quote, exaggerated porous skin texture. So if you can light an orange appealingly, you're well on your way to being able to light a human head. Now you might say here, yeah, but an orange is not white, right? You were talking about white skin before. Well, this is still the black and white era that John Alton is talking about. So orange shows up as white. So he's talking about lighting a white face. All right, so from the very beginning, you're being trained to light a white face. And in order to start lighting it, he describes an 8-point lighting system, which is listed here. So we don't use this exact system today, and I don't think John Alton actually invented it. He was just describing what was in widespread use at the time. We use something much simpler called a 3-point lighting method. But it is very similar to this. In fact, here are the 3 lights. So a subset of the 8 lights that Alton describes are used in the modern day. So we can see these in modern examples, like in the digital age. So again, just like in the analog era, there's tons of lighting manuals out there for the digital era, right? So I'm going to go ahead though and say Jeremy Burns' digital lighting and rendering. This is a big one, right? So this is what everybody referred me to when I first started out in computer graphics and wanted to know how to light, right? And Burns describes 3-point lighting. So here is a figure from chapter 5 of his book. You can see here is the 3-point lighting system. All right, so you got your key light, and let's look at Alton. Yeah, key light. So that one matches. And you got your fill light. All right, and again, fill light. Yeah, so Alton talks about that. So that one matches. And you got your rim light. Wait a minute. Alton called it the backlight. Why is it called the rim light in modern language? Why was the naming switched? All right, well, let's take a look. All right, so actually, Byrne does describe why the naming switch happened in his book. So the original intent of the backlight, especially in black and white film, was to separate the background from the foreground. So you can see here on the right, because there's a backlight, you can separate the top of the apple much more cleanly from the grays of the background using the backlight. So that's why it was called a backlight. Why is it called a rim light nowadays? Well, if you have a model with blonde hair, it will give her hair a glowing rim. So that's why it's called the rim light. It's there to make blonde hair glow. All right, and let's look at that picture of Giselle again. Her hair is really glowing, right? This is not a mistake. There is some intense rim lighting going on in this shot. So I'm not just speculating here. Alton says this directly. So he says, yes, it was developed for separating the background from the foreground, but hey, you know what else it's really great at? It's great at adding brilliance and life to the hair of blondes. So a bunch of people over the last 70 years, apparently they have agreed, because we don't call it the backlight anymore, we call it the rim light. So here we are again. In the analog era, when people talked about skin, they meant white skin. All right, so we can see that in the leader ladies used as development benchmarks. And we can see it in the stand-ins that were used for a human face. All right, and when we talk about hair, once again, we are definitely not talking about type 4 hair. Again, look at the leader ladies, nobody has type 4 hair. Look at John Alton's examples, nobody has type 4 hair. And in fact, even with Hattie McDaniel, we can see all her hair has been straightened and pulled back out of the shot. Again, there's a very difficult history here, but her type 4 hair, even if she had some, it is not in the shot. And we see the results here. So you can barely see where these servants' hair ends and their skin begins. So as far as the film technology is concerned, it was not made to capture dark skin and kinky hair. All right, so at least in part, this is where some of this racial bias comes from. It is our inheritance from the analog era. So the wheel of history turned, except this time we were the ones turning it. So what do we do now? This is the anti-racism part. So we recognize a problem. We see what happens when we just go with the flow. And we have to go against the flow. We have to do something that doesn't just repeat the same racist system that came before. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this. If you have an idea of how to do this, go ahead. Go ahead and try it. That's great, especially if you're a tenured professor, because basically nobody in our society is in a position to do something with more protection than you right now. So I'm going to propose something. It's going to sound pretty obvious and just a repeat of the history, but let's bear with me. This is my suggestion, right? So another one of the leading scholars on racial bias is Professor Ruha Benjamin, and her book Race After Technology is one of the big texts in this on this topic. If you look in her book, she talks about this very important concept called a Shirley card. What's a Shirley card? Actually, so Professor Benjamin, she references the core scholarly publication on this. This was actually written by another professor named Lorna Roth. I actually would highly recommend reading both Roth's article and Professor Benjamin's book. All right, so what is a Shirley card? This is the same concept as a leader lady that we saw before, but it's for photo development, not for film development. So Kodak started issuing these back in the 1950s as baselines for film development. So just like with leader ladies, your chemistry is off unless the white skin tones in this card start showing up like this. Right? The story here is exactly the same. Now, there actually was progress on this. So there's a very interesting story about why these cards started diversifying. And I'm not going to get into it here. I'm going to actually refer you to Professor Roth's article. She has like interviews with actual Kodak scientists. It's a really fascinating history. But the point is that these cards did start to diversify in the 1990s. So we have to do this too, right? Computer graphics needs the equivalent of diversified Shirley cards. So what we're doing right now, we're actually stuck back in the 70s, right? So let's go back to that Google image search that I did for skin shader, and we essentially have the 70s Shirley card, right? So It's all just images of white humans. Actually, some of them are actually the images of the same white human. What's going on here? All right, let's look at our technical publications again. So here were the technical publications that I showed you. And hey, here's that same person again, right? What's going on? And we'll go to the Pixar documentation. Hey, it's the same guy. What is going on here? All right, so this is a scan of a guy named Lee Perry Smith. So the scan of this person's head was released into the public domain back in 2010. So that's why everyone's using it. So free, high quality data is hard to come by. So once it's released, people just use it over and over. So we don't have a Shirley card in computer graphics, but we have something very similar, right? We're just rendering this same head over and over. So there's one key difference here. We don't actually have a ground truth. So you look at these three images and the head looks very different in all three of them, right? It's not quite doing what a benchmark is supposed to do. So we should come up with a benchmark of some kind, right? Now, all right, if you want to come up with a benchmark, you should give it like a catchy name of some kind. Now I said that back in the analog era, these things were called Shirley cards, right? Now the name Shirley, this was just some generic female name, and her true identity was just erased from history. I think it'll be really beautiful if we came up with the 21st century of this, but we actually did the opposite. So instead of naming it after some generic woman that we're trying to erase from history, instead we name this benchmark after the scholars who did the actual groundbreaking research on this topic. So if we come up with a benchmark, why don't we name it like a Roth card or a U card? So for the time being, let's go with Roth card. So benchmark development, this is in line with what Professor Roth advocates in this book, Captivating Technology. She calls it liberatory design. So this is in line with some of her research. So let's go with that. For the sake of argument, let's call it a Roth card. Let's develop a Roth card. So first of all, we need a complete Roth card, even for the white skin case, actually. So what are the measurements needed to make a complete Roth card, to make it a useful benchmark for research? The answer here is, I don't know. This is actually an open research problem. It actually sure sounds like our old Cornell box problem experiment in, so back in the 90s, right? So we've done something similar before. What's the version for skin? So once you have a white Roth card, you do have to make a diverse Roth card, like the diverse 90s Shirley cards, right? And you're going to run into the same measurement problems. So I don't have the answer for exactly what measurements to take here, but let's just imagine that these problems were solved, that we have a benchmark like this. It would be super valuable. How would it be valuable? All right, so some of you might be thinking, has this guy ever heard of Epic's MetaHuman creator? I'm pretty sure that Epic has already solved all the problems that he's talking about. Okay, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, Epic released a demo for this package, MetaHuman Creator, earlier this year. It is a package for creating virtual humans. So it quite prominently features Black men and women as the kinds of human that it can create. And if we're being fair, hey, look, it's type 4 hair. Finally, you see a digital image of it. That's great, right? So that's great, but I think it's just a first step. If we're really being good scientists, we do have to ask, is this doing a good job? So there's no benchmark, there's no Roth card really to compare against. So instead, we're just sort of stuck with, yeah, I guess this looks plausible, I guess. But let's imagine we actually had a Roth card. So as a stand-in for a Roth card, I'm just going to use screen grabs from movies. So here's that shot of Delroy Lindo from Clockers again. This looks way off to me, right? So I said before, the specularities are the things that dominate Delroy Lindo's face. And who deleted all the specularities in the metahuman, right? Why did someone jack up the subsurface so he looks really pink? All right, so maybe this is just Delroy Lindo. We can look at a different character from that movie. So here's Mickey Pfeiffer's character Strike from that same movie. And this one looks better, right? So it's actually pretty close. That's great. So maybe it's because Mickey Pfeiffer's younger than Delroy Lindo. Is that why that works? That doesn't seem to be the case. So there's a very young Isaiah Washington in that movie as well. And we look at him compared to the metahuman, and same problem. Who deleted all the highlights? Who jacked up this weird pinkish subsurface in the other face? All right. Okay, so maybe it's just this movie. Maybe the cinematographer, Malik Syed, we're just trying to overfit to his style. Here's a shot from Barry Jenkins's Moonlight, 2016 Best Oscar Picture winner. Totally different cinematographer. But again, we see the same phenomenon. Who deleted all the highlights? Why is there this pink subsurface jacked up in the metahuman? We can look at other examples. All right, so let's look at women. So here is the metahuman woman on the left and Lupita Nyong'o in Ryan Coogler's Black Panther. Same thing, right? Who deleted all the highlights? Why is there this jacked up pink subsurface? And we can look at Viola Davis in Steve McQueen's Widows. Same problem. Where are the highlights? What's the deal with the subsurface? So the point here is there's actually some really juicy, under-investigated visual phenomena associated with high melanin skin that we should be looking at. So we should make some actual Roth cards for these measurements, and then we can make some progress on the rendering front. All right, so what about hair? I've picked on the rendering folks enough. I'm gonna punch myself now. So I actually do simulation. Let's look at the simulation community. What about hair? So we don't have anything as standard as that one guy that gets rendered for everything in the simulation community for hair. The closest thing that I can find is this hairball test from the Adonis system back from SIGGRAPH 2014. This is from the Columbia group. All right, so they have this ball of hair and they just put it through these wild contortions. And you can see that something reasonable comes out. Again, this is not 100% of a benchmark, but people have picked it up. So the UCLA group did another test a few years later with the same configuration. Again, we need more of a benchmark because it's not exactly clear what to expect out of here. All right, and up to last year, Weta Digital actually used it as a test case for their paper. All right, so let's see what they did. And you can see that we're in the same boat here. So we're almost to the point where this is a benchmark, but there's something a little missing, some characterization of ground truth. So one potential Roth card for type 1 hair, right? These were all very straight versions of hair. And an exact quantitative definition of what the Roth card should be, still an open research problem. All right, what's the right Roth card for type 4 hair? The whole thing seems wide open, but I'm going to propose something. So once again, my brilliant colleague AM Dark, she pointed me to a whole bunch of type 4 hair care videos on YouTube. There's tons of these actually, if you go looking for them, and they're fascinating. All right, so now if you have type 1 hair and you just hang it down in a ponytail, it just sort of hangs down straight like this, right? With type 4 hair, this is from a YouTuber named Latanya Ebony. She pinches her hair kind of like in a ponytail, but you don't get the straight hair down like this. You get this beautiful elliptical shape instead. So what are the exact dimensions of this ellipse? How curly does your hair have to be before this ellipse starts happening? So again, there's lots of really interesting research questions here, and we should start looking at them. All right, so that's one thing that we can do, benchmark creation. So we can give them interesting names like U cards or Roth cards in recognition of the people who did all the groundbreaking scholarship on these topics. What else can we do? All right, well, first off, as reviewers and community members, we need to all agree that benchmark creation, this is 100% a legit thing to publish on. Otherwise, we're just going to have another decade where we see the same head rendered over and over. Let's not go there. All right, that part is pretty dry, but hopefully the next part isn't. We get to do the research, right? We get to come up with new math and new models for all different types of skin and hair. This is the fun part of science, right? And all of these versions of skin and hair, they are all worthy of investigation. The lack of models here, it's actually just holding us all back. So there's a high melanin skin paper just waiting to be published here. There's a type 4 hair simulation paper, it's just waiting to be published here. All right, now some difficult things will happen. If we're dealing with this kind of research, we're going to have to be on high alert for prejudice. We're going to have to be alert for our own internal prejudices, but unfortunately, there's going to be external prejudice as well. I can guarantee you that if somebody submits a technical paper on this topic to SIGGRAPH, it will be accused of just trying to solve some narrow topic that nobody cares about, or it'll be called a special case that is just too specialized for SIGGRAPH. Now, we've all been there. We should be on the lookout for claims like, I'm pretty sure existing methods can handle this. Usually you see this claim and it's backed up by no citations or citations that have actually nothing to do with anything. So we've all gotten reviews like this, and this was even before the topic you were dealing with had extreme social baggage attached to this. So when papers on these topics get submitted, we should expect these phenomena to increase by an order of magnitude, this kind of bias. So first of all, don't write these reviews yourself. And if you see somebody else making these kind of arguments, push back. So this is the inertia of systemic racism in action. So this does count as skin, and this does count as hair, because there are over 1 billion people in the world with this kind of skin and hair. This is not a niche topic. If somebody says otherwise, you should push back. Unfortunately, if you try to publish on this topic, it will also trigger explicit racism. Now, nobody in this day and age is dumb enough to actually verbalize their biases out loud. So instead, we're going to see dog whistles. So for example, well, acknowledging that different people have different types of hair will only increase racism. Therefore, in the name of anti-racism, we must reject this paper. So people are uncomfortable about talking about race, and they will do anything to stop talking about it. The explicit purpose of this type of argument is to make sure that the speaker never has to think about this topic ever again. And finally, we're going to see goalpost moving. So again, we've all been there before. So the reviewer starts demanding that your work meets some sort of impossibly high standard of science, a standard that even their work doesn't actually meet. And this gets ugly, even if you're not dealing with a controversial issue like race. So once again, once you introduce race, this sort of phenomena, it will get 10 times worse. So the goal of this argument is not to advance science. The goal is to halt research in this direction. Again, they are saying, this topic makes me uncomfortable, so in the name of science, I order you to stop. Now, unfortunately, people wrapping their prejudices in the mantle of science, this has a very long and ugly history. Don't let it happen again. Call this sort of thing out directly. Say something like, no paper has ever had to meet the standard that you are proposing. This paper must get published. So you do this sort of thing, and what'll happen is you'll be accused of trying to lower standards. So if you, for example, you've ever tried to make sure that like all the women job applicants for a certain position get treated fairly in the hiring process, you've heard this before. So we're just going to lower our standards now. Is that it? And that's not what's happening, right? You're actually trying to ensure that every human being is actually treated equally. So this is why it can't just be you that pushes back. It is not going to be enough for individuals to push back. It has to be everybody. Everybody has to be involved in the stewardship of papers that push back against this type of prejudice. In order for this to work, it has to involve all of us. So that's why the last piece is organizing. We're going to have to organize. Our field is freighted with a racial legacy that predates the invention of the modern computer. We are a part of a historical cycle that extends back over 100 years. If we want to break this pattern, it will take more than the good intentions of well-meaning individuals. It will take a collective action. If you want to be part of such an action, I'll be co-hosting a Birds of a Feather tomorrow. Now, a bunch of the scholars that I've mentioned in this talk, including Rocky Syed, are co-organizing this event with me, as well as rendering pioneers like Holly Reschmeyer and Wojciech Jaros. So we'll be meeting on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Pacific time and 5 p.m. Eastern time. So I hope to see you there. And finally, I'd like to wrap up with a huge thank you to Claudia Davis, Haley Iben, Sarah Jobalia, and Yuram Lee for providing invaluable comments on early versions of this talk. I give a huge thanks to them. And finally, a big thanks to you for listening to this talk.